Toshie-san's death came soon thereafter. As the, as the record-setting heatwave stretched on, the news was constantly occupied with stories of elderly people succumbing to heat stroke. And one day, our neighbor, already past her 70th year, was among them.
すみませんが、お帰りいただけませんか。
そんな、せめてお焼香だけでも。
由美子さん、あなたも知ってるでしょう。母が倒れた原因を。
それは
お給金が出るわけでもないのに、ねぎらいの言葉すらかけてもらえず、川本の家のために働き続けて、何とも思わないんですか。
申し訳ないと思っています。だから
もううちとは関わらないでください。もう川本の家とは一切の関係をなくしたいんです。地元でも変な噂が立ってますし。
おい早苗、それぐらいにしておきなさい。
はい、わかりました。それじゃこれで。
お礼だけでも言いたかった。
Your world is supposed to grow larger as you grow up. Mine seemed only to be shrinking ever smaller. I'd lost Toshie-san, and with her, the small place of refuge in front of our door vanished as well. Just as I was on the verge of giving up, finally, at long last, a small ray of light broke through the wall of dark clouds.
お母さん、具合いいみたいね。
My mother was eating a mandarin orange served as a treat after her meal. Her expression was as placid as always.
今日はなんだか体も軽く感じるわ。
But for once, it didn't look like a mask she had plastered onto her face. The peace in her eyes seemed real, something that had flowed naturally to the surface from deep inside her. Our retreat to the quiet of the countryside hadn't done much at first. If anything, our family tensions had probably taken a toll on my mother. But after many years of peace, it seemed her mind was slowly beginning to regain its equilibrium. The recent downturn had given way to weeks of a steady improvement. Once you can meet your own needs, it becomes possible to worry about the needs of others. My mother had begun to give my questions real responses for the first time in years.
お医者さんもいい兆しだっておっしゃってたし、来週からはお薬も減らしていくっていうことだったから、それで。
We'd never been able to discuss her treatment, but lately it had become a safe topic of conversation. Specifically, her progress was so promising that a discharge from the hospital was coming into view at long last.
来週の月曜日、おばあちゃんと一緒に先生にお話を聞くから、そこでいろいろと今後のことも聞いてくるわね。あと、
由美子。
何？お母さん。
由美子。あのね。ごめんね。お母さん、ひどいこと言って。あなたにこれだけしてもらっておいて、私、男の子の方がいいとか。
You done?
お母さん、いいから。ほら、みかん食べたから手が汚れてる。はい、ティッシュ。食べた皮片付けるわね。
ありがとう。
いいのよ。お母さんは直すことに専念してくれればいいから。私そろそろ戻るね。また明日来るから。
そう？ゆっくりしていけばいいのに。
また明日来るから。
I stood up and waved goodbye with a quavery smile. My mother was still sitting in profile, but I could tell she was smiling in return. Holding that image in my mind, I slipped quietly out of the room. The moment I closed the door behind me, the world began to shimmer through a wall of tears.
お母さん、よかった。
I couldn't remember the last time my mother had showed that kind of concern for me. I don't know if she ever had. By the standard of a healthy parent-child relationship, I guess it was an insignificantly small thing. But for me, at that moment, those tentative words of compassion were enough to inspire overwhelming happiness. Happiness so strong that I couldn't help but break down and sob.
よくなる。よくなってる。
I spoke the words again and again, as if to fix that fact more firmly in reality. Perhaps Toshie-san had taken pity on me and stopped by to heal my mother on her way to heaven. Things were suddenly moving in such a positive direction that such thoughts seemed almost plausible. The next week, my grandmother and I went to meet with Mom's physician for an update on her condition. Normally, I was the only one who attended those meetings, but the progress was significant enough that he asked Grandma to come as well.
美佐子さんは間違いなく解放に向かっています。
Flipping through the papers in his hand, he gave us a detailed account of my mother's symptoms and current status. Not that I really needed to hear any of it. I already knew she was recovering. For someone who'd visited her every single day for years, it was impossible to miss the transformation.
それでもう娘は大丈夫なんでしょうか？
Once the doctor's explanation came to an end, my grandmother leaned forward, clinging to his arm as she spoke.
治療も順調に進んでおりますし、このまま退院の準備を始めてもいいでしょう。
The moment those words left his mouth, my grandmother lowered her head so deeply I thought she might topple out of her chair and prostrate herself on the floor.
ありがとうございます。ありがとうございます、先生。
やめてください。頭をお上げになってください。
これで榊さんの家にも申し訳が立ちます。ありがとうございます。
Grandma continued to lavish her thanks on the doctor, as always, doing her best to pretend that I wasn't even in the room. Mom's return to her husband would ensure that the Kawamoto business would continue receiving support from the Sakaki family. It was blatantly obvious from my grandmother's words that it was the sole reason for her gratitude. To the woman who had brought her into the world, my mother was nothing but a defective political tool. But that only strengthened my determination to take care of her. Once the doctor's explanation was over, my grandmother went straight home without even stopping by to see her daughter's face. I heard her muttering the name of business partners to herself as she went. She was probably planning to hurry back to the house and inform them of the news. Then again, I wasn't exactly eager to have her visit my mother with that sort of an attitude. So if anything, her quick departure was convenient.
お母さん、来週退院が決まったわ。
Dropping a pile of magazines and books onto the shelf, as usual, I spoke to my mother in a tone of sincere cheerfulness.
そう。じゃあ、おばあちゃんやおじいちゃんに迷惑をかけることもなくなるのね。うん。何より、こうやって由美子に来てもらわなくても大丈夫になるから、それが一番安心ね。
お母さん。
私、由美子にこうして負担をかけてるのが本当に申し訳なかったから。
My mother spoke those words with real remorse in her voice. But at that moment, the burden didn't seem so heavy. My mother's feelings were more than enough compensation.
カーテン、開けてもらえるかしら。
Just as requested, I pulled back the curtains from the window at Mom's side. A vault of blue stretched out beyond the panes of glass. It was the very picture of a summer sky. Compared to the heart of the city where the Sakaki house stood, the blue in that place seemed far more pure and vivid.
今日もいい天気ね。ここを出るときには一度屋上に上がって空を見てみたいわ。
That's a death flag if I ever hear one. Toshie-san told me once that my mother had always enjoyed gazing at the sky. She didn't look for anything in particular, just tilted her head back and watched. And when people asked her why, she could never find an answer. Memories from the day we first came to town flashed into my mind. We'd walked hand in hand under a beautiful blue sky, but Mother's dull, lifeless eyes had never left the path below our feet. But she had finally remembered the sky. That could only mean she was on her way to recovery.
そうだね。ここを出るときには一緒に空を見ようね。
ね。
It occurred to me that I didn't have a single memory of the two of us doing something like that together. I found myself very much looking forward to the small event that would accompany my mother's discharge from the hospital. Everything was moving in a positive direction. The stupidly optimistic scenario I had sketched out in my imagination was coming closer and closer to reality. My mother's recovery produced clear changes in my own emotions. I'd barely spoken to anyone in a week since Toshie-san's death, but I was slowly beginning to communicate with those around me. My grandparents still kept their distance, but if I approached them myself using my mother as a pretext, I could at least get them to have a conversation with me. Mom's recovery was their primary objective after all. They couldn't avoid hearing me out if I brought it up. Watching my grandparents interact with me despite obvious reluctance, I felt as though I had achieved a small but significant rebellion against the people who'd spend years ignoring my very existence. I'm right here. I'm in an important position. More than anything else, that sense of meaning gave me strength. In school, the others still rejected my very existence, but that didn't bother me much anymore. I would be returning to the Sakaki house once my mother recovered. This hollow school life would be over soon enough. The end was in sight. That suffocating feeling of entrapment was gone. No matter what they said about me, no matter how they laughed, it rolled off me harmlessly. 3 days before my mother was scheduled to leave the hospital, I was hurrying to school through the rain. The drizzle that had begun a little after midnight was just picking up into a steady, heavy rain as I left the house. My umbrella wasn't enough to catch it all. Pausing for a moment, I glanced up at the angry sky beyond the edge of my umbrella. It was covered in deep black clouds from horizon to horizon, without so much as a patch of clear sky in between.
お母さん、憂鬱だろうな。
Since our conversation the other day, Mom had begun to spend a lot of time looking out her window. That was nice enough when the weather was clear, but staring up at a menacing sky like that might inspire a bit of gloominess just as our feelings were finally starting to take an upward swing. I'd have to hurry to the hospital and cheer Mom up as soon as school was over. With that thought, I began to walk again. And just as I reached the intersection between the road to school and the main street leading to the station, a familiar face appeared from around the corner.
どうもどうも。由美子ちゃん、久しぶりだね。元気してた？
おじさん、
But it wasn't a face I was eager to see. I instantly recognized the tabloid reporter who had once wheedled me into becoming a source for an article that mixed fragments of truth with innuendo and lies. Standing under a large jet-black umbrella that seemed to mirror the rain clouds above, he looked me over with a faint smile on his face.
いやー、しばらく見ないうちに可愛くなったね。お母さん譲りかな？それともお父さんに似たのかな？
His words seemed to have grown even greasier and more presumptuous than before. When I walked past him silently, the reporter fell easily in beside me, keeping pace as though I'd invited him to follow.
ちょっと聞きたいことがあってね。またここに来るようになったんだけど、そこの喫茶店で話とか聞かせてくれないかな？
以前にも言いましたよね。私はあなたにお話しするようなことは一切やりません。
I think Isaten is like a cafe, not necessarily a coffee shop.
そんな。君のお父さんのことじゃないか。話すことなんかたくさんあると思うんだけどな。
ありません。父とはもう何年も会っていないんです。
It was incredibly unpleasant to have this man bring up that topic now. The Sakaki house was the invisible mass around which we all orbited. I knew my current lifestyle was possible only because of his financial support, but sometimes I couldn't help feeling a powerful burst of resentment toward the father I barely knew. In particular, when people carelessly assume we must have some kind of relationship.
もういいですから、付きまとわないでください。変な噂を立てられるので。
Stopping briefly, I spat out the clearest possible rejection, then quickly turned around to leave. I couldn't allow trouble of this sort to arise so soon before Mom was about to leave the hospital. There was no telling how speaking to this man for even the briefest of moments might come back to haunt me.
本当にそうなのかな？
The reporter, no longer trying to follow, called out to me from behind. His words were suggestive, his tone unusually serious. I came to a halt despite myself.
だから、 何なんですか一体。
Rationally, I understand. It would have been the same either way. I know that it wasn't the cause of what would follow. But still, somewhere deep down inside, I can't help believing everything would have been different if only I had walked away.
そうもいかないんだよ。だってこの話、君に弟ができたってことなんだからね。
She not gonna say that word? What?
弟。
When I turned back to face him, the man was wiping at his rain-damp forehead with a knowing smirk on his face.
これに載ってるよ。もっとも、由美子ちゃんが読むような雑誌じゃないけどね。
The reporter reached out and presented me with a magazine, already open to a certain article. Practically grabbing it from his hands, I ran my eyes frantically across the page. And the moment I saw that headline, the blood in my veins seemed to freeze solid. East Beach Express President Sakaki Michiaki's illegitimate child? Long-awaited son born to a mistress. Bold, sans-serif headlines, emphasized by sharp decorative flourishes. Below, the face of a man I hadn't seen in a while lined up with a portrait of his unfamiliar partner. Paragraphs full of vicious words that I could barely stand to read. And at the very end, one sentence that plunged me below even despair. As I had doubted my ears in a hospital room weeks before, this time I doubted my eyes. Currently arranging for a divorce from his wife. Those few brief words, buried in the final paragraph as if they were the most trivial thing in the world, hit me with the force of a hurricane.
こんなの。
I'd heard the rumors. I more or less understood that father was that sort of person. But there was no worse way to have those suspicions confirmed. Why? Why now when my mother was recuperating in the hospital? Why now when she was finally getting better? Was this article even true? Many thoughts swirled chaotically through my head. My hands trembled and lost their hold on that hateful piece of paper.
うわ、ちょっと落とさないでよ。これだって一応資料なんだからさ。
The magazine fell to the wet pavement with a slap. As it hit the ground, the pages that had been folded back flipped around, revealing the cover. And as if to turn the dagger in my wound, one final piece of information was revealed to me.
この雑誌。
A tasteful work from a well-known painter, behind a number of carefully arranged headlines in a firm serif typeface. A weekly magazine, but one that clearly distinguished itself from the tabloids and gossip rags. A magazine of some credibility. A magazine my mother asked for every week.
というわけで、ぜひこの件について、お姉ちゃんとしてコメントを聞きたいんだけど、時間を。って、ちょっと、おい!
Charging off the sidewalk that ran alongside the prefectural highway, I sprinted all out along a farm road, slanting diagonally away through fields of green. The path didn't turn toward my school, so it offered an ever so slightly more direct route. But it was only a farm road. In places, it hadn't even been paved. It was an extremely difficult course to run on a rainy day.
お母さんがこれを読んだりしたら。
But I didn't have the luxury of worrying about that right at that moment. I needed to get to the hospital as soon as I possibly could. I needed to stop my mother. With the recent improvement in her condition, Mom had to start to leave her room and visit the hospital store to purchase her own books and magazines. If the nurses were still delivering them with the mail, there was at least a chance they checked for articles that might upset her. But it was hard to imagine the clerks in the shop would have been told to do the same.
なんで？どうして？
Halfway there, I could no longer muster the effort to keep my umbrella up right above me. I let the rain strike me and focus all my attention on running. Water went flying with every heavy stride, slapping against my legs, soaking my skirt. The small ember of satisfaction warming my chest only minutes before had been smothered completely out of existence. I was cold to my very core.
ちょっと廊下を走らないでください。 すみません。
My momentum barely slowed after arriving at the hospital. I understood perfectly well that running the hallways was off limits, but the rules I'd always obeyed mattered less than reaching my destination even a moment sooner.
お母さん、お母さん。
Turning a corner on the third floor, I finally entered the wing reserved for private rooms. A moment later, my feet came to an abrupt halt. There was something unusual going on in front of that familiar door. For a moment, I was simply bewildered. 3 strange men in expensive suits were standing just outside my mother's room, talking to each other, just on the verge of entering. A vague but powerful sense of dread ran through my body like a jolt of electricity.
何をしてるんですか？
I shouted angrily as I approached. The man who'd been reaching for the door hesitated. Before I could continue, the white-haired man at the head of the little group preempted me with a question.
失礼ですが、どちら様ですか？
この病室の榊美佐子の娘です。あなたたちこそ誰なんですか？母に何のご用ですか？
Unperturbed by my fierce attitude, the white-haired man answered with a calm smile.
ああ、あなたが由美子さんですね。申し遅れました。私、榊家の顧問弁護士をしております津田と申します。
顧問弁護士。
ええ、この度はお母様の件でちょっとお話がございまして立ち寄らせていただきました。お母様はいらっしゃいますか？
The magazine article I'd read minutes before flashed vividly before my eyes. Currently arranging for a divorce. In a heartbeat, my mind connected those words to this lawyer's sudden arrival.
会わせません。
は？
母と父を離婚させるために来たのでしょう。今母は病気なんです。そんな話なんかしたらどうなるかわかるでしょう。
由美子さん、それは誤解です。私たちはその件ではなく今後のお二人のことについて。
嘘、さっき雑誌で見たわ。全部知ってるんだから。
The man's composed face distorted into a scowl at the word magazine. He must have been trying to reach us before that information did.
仕方ないな。おい。
はい。
With a small movement of the lawyer's hand, the 2 men who'd been hanging back moved quickly toward me. They had me physically subdued before I could even register surprise. One man had slipped behind me and caught my arms in a firm, full Nelson. The other stood in front of me like a wall, eliminating any chance of escape. I screamed desperately, but they weren't the sort of people to flinch at the cries of a young woman. The private wing was never a busy place. Today, it was entirely empty, and with the heavy rain drumming down outside, I doubt anyone elsewhere in the building even heard my voice. And of course, against the strength of 2 full-grown adults, a child like myself was completely powerless.
しばらくおとなしくしていてください。
The lawyer's voice had grown cold. It was the all-too-familiar voice of an adult.
榊美佐子さん、弁護士の津田と申します。お話があってまいりました。失礼しますよ。
His words were extremely polite. If anything, that made him all the more frightening. Ignoring my tear-choked plea, he pushed open the door to my mother's hospital room. I was the first to react. The bed sitting by the window, which had always been occupied before, was now empty.
うざいか。まあいい。待たせてもらうこととしよう。
In contrast to the perpetually calm lawyer, I was filled with a profound sense of unease. The doctors always made their rounds at this time of the day. None of the patients were allowed to move around freely, much less my mother. They'd given her a normal space for the sake of camouflage, but by all rights, she belonged in a room with bars on the window. Normally, it wouldn't be unusual to move a patient only 3 days from discharge back into the hospital's general ward, but my mother's condition was still delicate. Her physician had decided to handle everything cautiously until the very end. It just wasn't possible that mom had simply stepped out at this time of day.
何ですかあなたたちは。
The doctor had arrived for his daily rounds. For a moment, he simply stared at the bizarre scene inside the room with confusion in his eyes.
母が
Before the lawyer could stand to offer a greeting, I yelped out from the corner where the man had deposited me.
ついさっきまでここにいたと報告を受けていたんですが、そうだろう。
He turned to the nurse at his side for confirmation, a hint of alarm in his voice.
はい、確認しましたのでそう伝えましたが。
The startled nurse looked around the room as if expecting to find my mother hiding in a corner. It was all too much for me to process. Everything was moving forward smoothly only an hour ago, but now we were derailed, hurtling rapidly away into darkness and confusion, all of our painstaking work falling apart around us. I had to look for my mother. I had to keep her from finding out about that article. I had to get out of this room, away from these people. Countless thoughts stampeded wildly through my head, but there was just one thing that seemed clear to me. I couldn't just sit there waiting. Before anything else, I had to find Mom. And all of a sudden, I remembered.
ここを出るときには一度屋上に上がって空を見てみたいわ。
The words rang out so clearly in my ears that for a moment, I thought she was really there, speaking to me. Pushing my way around the man who'd been holding me in check, I slipped past the doctor and dashed out into the deserted hallway.
こら、待ちなさい。
I heard voices from behind. I ignored them. I didn't have any real proof, but there was nothing else for me to go on, so I had no choice but to cling to my intuition. Taking the stairs two at a time, I headed for the very top of the building. By the time I managed to struggle all the way to the rooftop, my breath was coming in quick, ragged gasps, and my legs were burning beneath me. I felt about ready to collapse. After all, I'd sprinted from my house to the hospital, and then from Mom's room up to the roof, with barely a pause in between. But my exhaustion was the last thing on my mind. I threw myself against the door with the last of my momentum, swinging it open wide. Alone in the dark, engulfed by the roar of the rainstorm, I screamed for my mother. It was coming down so hard now that mist was rising from the bare concrete. Even seeing across the rooftop was a challenge. Naturally enough, given the weather, I couldn't make out any signs of human presence. But just as I muttered those words, a white shadow stirred in the darkness. It was a human being, a woman dressed in the white clothes of a patient, standing in the rain. From her height and length of her hair, I realized at once it was my mother. I splashed through the puddles to her side. She was staring blankly up into the sky, battered by the powerful rain, her entire body utterly soaked. I grabbed my mother by the shoulder and shook her frantically, trying to catch her attention. But her eyes were fixed on the sky. She didn't do so much as budge. It was obvious at a glance that something was terribly wrong. Halfway through the sentence, I noticed something lying on the ground at the very edge of my peripheral vision. It was flopping around in the wind. I had the feeling I'd seen it before. Not that long ago, in fact. That cover, that tasteful painting, the work of a well-known artist, those headlines set in a restrained, professional font. The magazine containing that article was lying at my mother's feet. My hand slipped off her shoulder. I staggered backward, barely staying on my feet. Why had this happened? Why did everything have to fall apart just when we were finally starting to move forward? Why was my mother standing there, soaking wet? Why did she have that blank expression on her face? Many questions bubbled to the surface of my mind. None of them had answers. They just sat there suspended in my mind, stagnating, until they putrefied into a pool of solid sludge. My mother fixed her lifeless eyes on mine. I was startled. It was the first time for as long as I could remember that my mother had looked me straight in the face. But that was, without a doubt, the worst possible way for that chain to be broken. There was no light in Mom's eyes. The words she spoke posed a question, but there was nothing like actual curiosity behind them. It was the voice of a machine.
言ってるの？
I wanted desperately to convince myself she was joking. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't make myself believe it. The evidence before my eyes was simply too powerful.
どなたですか？
Mom's face was paler than white, and at the center of her white eyes, there were two bottomless dark wells where her pupils had been. Those tiny spots of black seemed more vast and more profound than the black sky stretching out endlessly above us. I was standing on the edge of an abyss, and I was afraid. It felt as though I might fall into those pools of darkness and disappear. But I couldn't stop staring. I couldn't avert my eyes from the thing that was trying to swallow me whole. After all, she was the only person left in the world who would ever acknowledge my existence. I called out to her, praying the word might pull her back from across the chasm that separated us. But it was too wide. My voice was too weak. I was too weak. I shrunk away, just one step. My heels slid backward across the wet roof. And then, for just a moment, it felt as though my body was floating. Disoriented by a sharp impact to my backside, I didn't realize that I'd been pushed out of the way until I saw the doctor moving past me.
早く他の患者に見つからないようにベッドへ。
As I sat stunned on the wet concrete, they took my vacant-eyed mother in their arms. They were carrying her off like an oversized doll, away from me, to some place I didn't know. Pushing myself up off the ground, screaming, I ran toward her. I didn't make it 3 steps before another nurse caught me in her arms.
大丈夫よ、由美子さん。大丈夫だから。
どこに連れて行くの？やめて！
Rising above the pattering of the black rain, a baleful roar filled the air, crawling up from the depths of the earth, demolishing everything in its path. That sound, like a massive boulder tumbling relentlessly across the world, merged with the scene before my eyes and engraved itself violently onto my heart. I tried to follow with my eyes as they carried her away. I strangled out one final cry. In response, the world filled with intense light, as though a dozen cameras had flashed at once. For a moment, I was dazzled. And by the time my vision returned to normal, there was nothing left to see. No, not quite nothing. On that otherwise empty roof, one waterlogged magazine remained. It was dissolving by now, paper melting away, ink blurring into illegibility. But my memory of the truth it contained wouldn't disappear so easily. My broken mother was gone. The doctor who'd smiled and told me she would be leaving the hospital was gone. I was absolutely alone. I crumbled where I stood. My knees hit the ground first, then my hands, then my face. The wet concrete was pleasantly cold against my cheek. Maybe if I lay here long enough, I would melt away and disappear, just like that magazine.
冷たい。
The ground was cold, but my body was hot. I'd used up everything I had. I was empty. I'd given up on the very idea of moving. The merciless rain continued to pour down on me. Jet black rain, even though it wasn't night. The vicious dark water pooled around me, creeping up my body as if to swallow me whole. Sometimes, I hate that this country has 4 seasons. Just when I'm finally starting to forget, an autumn wind reminds me of a whispered insult. Winter skies bring back cold and lonely memories. And in summer, when the sudden evening storms arrive, I'm torn apart with every clap of thunder. Again and again, till there's nothing left. 1 year after my mother's relapse, things had quieted down. The commotion at the hospital created a bit of a stir around town, but it didn't take long for the talk to trickle to a halt. For one thing, the main character in the story was no longer a resident. And even our cold-hearted country gossips seemed hesitant to turn a gravely ill woman's condition into one of their nasty little jokes. I was absent from school for a week after the incident, recovering from the shock and a mild case of pneumonia, but my life eventually returned to its normal rhythm. That would be the superficial summary, at least. The trauma of reading that magazine article led to a dramatic downturn in my mother's condition. She was now suffering from acute memory loss. Her physician, my grandparents, my father, and me, we were all strangers to Mom now. Everyone she met slipped out of her mind within minutes. Less memory loss, and I guess it's more dementia. These symptoms were far beyond anything a local hospital was equipped to handle. Soon after the incident, Mom was transferred to a specialized psychiatric institution in North Kanto. Ironically enough, the divorce never actually came to pass. Perhaps my father backed off out of concern for his public image. That, or it was part of some conditional legal arrangement. I don't know. One thing, however, was perfectly clear. The connection between the Sakaki and Kawamoto houses had been severed. My two families spent the first months after the incident squabbling by proxy about legal issues and the care of their mutual burdens. In the end, the Sakaki continued to cover my mother's medical expenses, but they were no longer providing supplementary support to the Kawamoto family's floundering business.
美佐子の件だけは責任を取らせたけど、これで支援もなくなって。どうするつもりですか、あなた。
つつましくやっていけばなんとかなる。すまんが、しばらくは我慢をしてくれんか。
歴史のある川本の家がこんな粗末な生活をするようになるなんて。しかもあの子の面倒まで見なければいけないなど、こんなバカな話がありますか。
まったく、なぜこんなことになってしまったのかな。
I know what you did to deserve this. You weren't doing anything except for leeching off of people. Even long after the matter was settled, my grandparents never seemed to tire of moaning about the unfairness of it all. And of course, as the easiest target for their bitterness, I once again found myself wedged between a rock and a hard place. I had the bare minimum required for a normal life. They always kept up appearances after all. But not a day went by when I didn't hear sarcastic, scornful words from the shadows. I went to a silent school and returned to a silent home. I'd lost my refuge. I'd lost my hope. All I could do was suffer quietly. This would be the point where a normal person might go bad. But I had been living inside a cage for so long that not even though that choice was available to me. There was a time, just once, when I tried approaching a group of girls with that sort of reputation. The result was pathetic. In that country town, even the delinquents were mindful of appearances. They turned their backs on me and walked away without a word. Shunned even by those lowest on the totem pole, for a long moment I just stood there, rooted to the spot. And then I found myself looking up into the sky. It looked no different from the day I'd gazed out the window with my mother. Had Mom always been alone? Was that why she'd spend so much time watching something that never really changed? Now that I was well and truly isolated, I'd begun to think more about her feelings.
泣くこともできないのね。
It seemed like the moment worthy of a little sobbing, but it just wasn't happening. On that day in the rain, I'd used up my lifetime supply of tears. All that was left was a parched, withered husk of a human being. A day in early September, our teacher had fallen ill that afternoon. The final lesson were replaced by a study hall, which I'd spent gazing dully out the window. That exercise in pure boredom finally complete, I was walking sluggishly down the road toward my grandparents' house, just turning the final corner onto our street.
あれ
Something was wrong about this picture. A shiny black luxury car was parked along the thickly hedged road in front of our house. The Kawamoto family didn't own a private automobile. My grandfather apparently had one back in the days business was doing well, but it was one of the first things to go when the recession hit. The negotiations with the Sakaki family had always been held in the business office by the station, so it was hard to imagine why such a car could have possibly come.
誰だろ
For a little while, I dawdled outside, staring curiously at the car with its thickly tinted windows. But after 2 or 3 minutes, a voice called to me from inside our house.
遅かったじゃないの、由美子ちゃん。早く上がって。
え
I was startled. The friendly attitude was one thing, but it was the very first time since I'd arrived that my grandmother had called me by name. She wouldn't have done that without a very good reason.
はい
After quickly removing my shoes, I let her usher me in the parlor. It was the first time in a good 4 years that I'd been in that room. The instant I crossed the threshold, 5 men in black suits stood up simultaneously and bowed in greeting. As I blinked in bewilderment, my grandmother spoke, a strange little smile twisting her face.
ほら、そこに座って。由美子ちゃんが話に入らないと進まないことなんだから。
And with that, she sat me at the head of the table. The dusty air of the rarely used parlor tickling my nose, I looked around me. All 5 of the men had deeply serious expressions on their faces. To be honest, I wanted nothing more than to run away.
一体何の話なんですかこんな急に
As soon as the question left my mouth, a man seated to my left took control of the conversation.
お父様、榊道明様の命により、由美子様をお迎えに上がりました。
お迎えに
はい。お父様は昨年の一件で、由美子様をとても心配していらっしゃいました。それで、こうしてお迎えに上がった次第です。
What on earth was this man talking about? After the incident with Mom, my father hadn't showed up in this house even once. I understood that you had a busy professional life, but he didn't even bother to send a message or place a phone call. Now they expected me to believe he was worried. Now, after a full year. Ridiculous. It was mystifying Grandma had even let them in the house, let alone with that simpering grin on her face. Didn't she understand this was nonsense? But soon I discovered that my grandmother's reactions were perfectly lucid, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of that.
よかったわね、由美子ちゃん。これでいい学校に通えるし、お父様とも一緒に住めるのよ。
いろいろあったが、これからは何の心配もしないで暮らせるんだ。よかったな。
お父様からもまたこの家を助けていただけるそうで、本当によかったわ。
Ah, now I understood. This was a question with no choices. My grandparents had decided the answer beforehand, and were now unilaterally forcing me toward it. I was so profoundly astonished at their naked self-interest that I couldn't even manage any anger. But it's not as if snapping at them would have achieved anything in the first place. Remaining with them was probably never really an option.
わかりましたすぐに準備をしてきます
When I stood from my seat, my grandmother spoke in a sickly, sweet voice.
あらあら、そこまで急がなくてもいいのよ。榊家の方は明日もまたいらっしゃるというし、それまで。
いえ結構です今いらっしゃってるのならその車に乗っていきます
あら、そうなの？由美子ちゃんがそういうのなら仕方ないわよね、あなた。
ああ、もちろんそうだ。由美子のいいようにすればいいからな。
I was about ready to vomit. From my grandmother's words, it seemed clear the Sakaki had come with a clear offer in hand. My return in exchange for restored financial support to the Kawamoto business. My grandparents had considered me a burden from the start, so I imagine they didn't exactly hesitate. It probably felt like selling some piece of junk from the backyard for a huge sum at auction.
汚らしい
I tried muttering the words, but couldn't manage much conviction. After all, I was scuttling around the same sordid web. How could I complain? I wasn't working for my food. I pulled all the clothes out my chest of drawers, threw them onto my tatami mat, and scowled down at them.
さようなら
I wasn't speaking to my grandparents, the house, or even my mother. It was a farewell to the person who had lived here, idly wasting day after empty day, accomplishing nothing but growing older. I spoke those words to confirm a simple fact. That room was nothing to me. It held nothing of me. One by one, I cut the clothes I'd worn into place to shreds. The expensive-looking children's clothes I brought with me, the generic ready-made supermarket clothes my grandparents had bought me when the need arose, my middle school uniforms. My face an emotionless mask, I carefully chopped them into tiny pieces.
これで終わり。
My preparations were complete. Grabbing the scrapped clothes with both hands, I shoved them right back into my chest of drawers. It took less than a minute to toss my everyday belongings, art supplies, and sketchbooks into my bag. Just like that, my life in that place was over. I didn't look back. After a stiff, formulaic goodbye to my grandparents, I dropped by my school for a few brief formalities, then began the journey home. Of course, I hadn't seen that home in many years. I had only the vaguest memories of the house itself. I was sincerely happy to be leaving my grandparents behind, but that didn't make me any less uncertain about the new life being thrust on me so abruptly. The car headed north at high speed, moving from the coastline into the outskirts of the metropolitan area. We were heading for the heart of West Tokyo.
あと、どれぐらいで着くのですか？
An elderly man who had introduced himself as the chief of the clerical department at my father's company was behind the wheel.
車が混んでいなければ、あと30分もすれば着くかと存じます。
Glancing briefly at his GPS screen, he answered my question in a calm tone.
そうですか。
60 kilometers, as the crow flies. That was the distance from my grandparents' house to that of my father. In the end, my mother had never managed to return to a place less than an hour away by car. And I myself was only coming back on someone else's power. I didn't have the slightest idea what was coming next. I wasn't particularly hopeful, but I didn't feel much in the way of despair either. It would be enough if I could just spend my days quietly until I finally became an adult. With that thought, I closed my eyes and waited for the car to arrive at its destination. Just as the chief's secretary had told me, we reached my new home about 30 minutes later.
大きい。
The house was very different from the patchwork image I had sewn together from fragments of my childhood memories, far more magnificent than I remembered it. From the outside, the building itself looked like a Western-style mansion straight out of a manga. The spacious gardens were surrounded by a high wall. The grounds were covered in so many tall, beautiful trees that it could have been a park. I had hazy memories of those things, but after years in the country, their scale and magnificence took me by surprise. But on an emotional level, the sight left me cold. My father's actions were one thing. My obedient return at his whistle was another. No matter how splendid the house might have been, when I thought about the foundation it was built on, my thoughts naturally took a turn for the bitter.
お母さんと戻ってこられたら。
I whispered the words to myself, too softly for the driver taking my luggage from the trunk to hear. Passing through a finely wrought metal gate, I returned to the house I spent my first years in. The uninspiring luxury was all the more pronounced inside the house itself. As I took off my shoes and looked around the gleaming entrance hall, I heard footsteps approaching from a side passage.
ユミコ、戻ったか。大きくなったな。
It probably would have taken me some time to recognize the person standing in front of me. I see that typo? If not for the recent photograph I'd seen in a certain magazine 1 year before. Face to face with my father for the first time in what felt like decades, I saw a middle-aged man with a reasonably healthy complexion, but a subtle hint of something like gloom in his eyes.
ただいま戻りました。
As I lowered my head in a polite bow, my father continued in the same cheerful tone.
どうした？声に元気がないじゃないか。車に長い時間乗ったから疲れたのか。
え？
I was more taken aback than anything else. Considering the way he had treated Mom and me up until that point, His aggressively friendly attitude was incomprehensible. From what I could remember, my father and I had only spoken a bare handful of times when I was a child, and certainly never like that. His motives weren't clear to me, but the sudden attempt at intimacy was off-putting. I didn't quite know how to respond to it.
大丈夫です。ちょっとお部屋に戻って休みます。
For the moment, I just wanted to cut the nauseating conversation short.
ああ、わかった。ユミコの好きなようにするといいよ。
失礼します。
With another bow to my father, I made my way past him, heading for the one part of the house I remembered well. My very first place of refuge, the bedroom in which I had spent so many hours as a young child. I climbed the stairs and found my room without the slightest hesitation. Remembering its location so exactly prompted a brief swell of nostalgic emotion, but that soon gave way to that recurring sense of disgust. My memories there weren't exactly happy in their own right. The room I entered for the first time in years was so completely changed that I couldn't help raising my voice in surprise. The badly mismatched desk and bed had been cleared away. In their place was a complete arrangement of fancy furniture and pretty little luxury items, exactly the sort of things that might appeal to a girl of my age.
わざわざ揃えたのかしら。
Every part of the decor seemed as if it could have come straight from the set of a movie. The room was filled with fragile, ephemeral things. It felt as though they'd disappear like soap bubbles if I actually touched them. Normally, they would have made me happy, but at the moment, it seemed a hollow gesture.
お母さん、帰ってきたわよ。
Sitting on my bed, I murmured those words to myself. I'd finally managed to return to that house, but my mother wasn't with me. All I had there was a forced, artificial welcome from the man who had broken her. Would I simply resume the same numb, miserable life in a different setting? Staring up at the ceiling, I could feel the familiar jet-black sludge growing thick inside my chest. I fought down the crushing feelings of despair as best I could, closed my eyes and fell asleep. The next day, my father had arranged beforehand for my transfer into an all-girls school some 20 minutes from the mansion by car. It was a very prestigious institution. I'd actually recognized the name. I felt badly out of place, uncomfortable with my new uniform and the beautiful school building.
ねえ、あの子が。そうよね。榊家の。
I could hear the whispers from all sides. Entering the classroom, I sat quietly at an open desk as far from the others as possible. There was an improvement in one regard. The talk about me wasn't particularly cruel or hostile.
訳ありなのよね。ええ、ちょっとお近づきには。
But essentially, I was treated just like before. My classmates interacted with me in a businesslike way when necessary, and otherwise largely pretended I wasn't there. A school full of young ladies from upper-crust families was surprisingly uncomfortable in its own way.
いい天気。
Having completed my formulaic introduction in the first day of classes, I found myself instinctively heading for the rooftop. After gazing up for a moment, I settled down against a concrete support near the edge of the roof and took out my sketchbook. I began to draw the sky above me. A simple pencil hatching, rendering the clouds and sky in shades of gray. That afternoon, I couldn't stand to look at the world. Anything my eyes settled on repulsed me. The empty sky was the only thing I could bring myself to observe calmly. The driver held open the front door to the house for me. I was delivered to school and back. I didn't even have to open my own doors anymore. That extreme courtesy only intensified my discomfort.
お帰りなさいませ。
The household employees greeted me with smiles so soft and mild it was slightly nauseating. When I answered with a brief nod, they began to bombard me with words in rapid succession, their tone eager and openly professional.
由美子様、何か召し上がりますか？いえ、結構です。部屋へ戻ります。
では何かお飲み物をお持ちしましょうか？
それも結構です。喉は渇いておりませんから。
それでは何かありましたらお申し付けください。
はい。
Climbing slowly up the stairs, I heaved a heavy sigh. Would they be putting on that sort of show every single day from now on? Their deference was so transparently artificial that it was painful rather than flattering. Given my current position, it just might be possible to order them to stop acting like that. But I didn't know what repercussions that would have, especially if they were to report it to my father. I ended up deciding it best not to make waves at such an early stage. I'd been able to postpone it for one day with excuses about my fatigue, but the time had come.
久しぶりだね。こうして由美子と食事をとるのは。
A glass of wine in one hand, my father turned a radiant smile on me.
はい。
Inside my head, I spat out the words, "It's the first time." From the moment I sat down in front of that luxurious dinner and my beaming father, I was immediately filled with a desperate longing to flee. I tried a little of the sautéed duck on my plate just to kill a few seconds, but it seemed strangely tasteless and without texture.
学園の先生から褒められたよ。転入する際の成績が抜群だったとね。これなら学校間のレベル差はほとんど関係ないとのことだった。
My father, still maintaining the same cheerful tone as the night before, complimented me at great length. All I could manage was to nod and mechanically shovel the food placed in front of me into my mouth. Course after course, and I couldn't taste a thing. Had they even put any salt on these? It was like eating hunks of rubber. Carrying things to my mouth solely for the sake of chewing on them didn't make for a pleasant dining experience. Gradually, I began to ignore my plate in favor of frequent sips of water.
気持ち悪い。
The tasteless food, Dad's barrage of praise, and myself sitting there passively just accepting it all. Everything about the scene made me sick. My emotions only grew darker with every passing minute. This was all some bizarre whim of my father's. That, or a meaningless ceremony he was carrying out in pursuit of some hidden objective. What else could it possibly be?
由美子、髪はずっと伸ばしているのか？
I felt my breath catch in my throat. That summer day, the day when the heat had poured down on me like a rain of molten iron. The moment when I had clawed at my chest and hacked at my own hair in a spasm of self-loathing. It all came flooding vividly back.
はい。
I almost told him that I'd cut it short once. But what would be the point of explaining that to this man? It would only throw this little play into chaos. What on earth did my father mean by asking me a question like that? Why bring up the very thing that had always marked me as worthless?
そうか。とてもよく似合ってるよ。
My father, a smile on his face, spoke those words in a casual tone of voice.
由美子、
すみません。
Rising from my seat, I ran out of the room, both hands pressed tightly across my mouth.
おい、何か体に合わないものがあったんじゃないのか？
I could hear my father snarling at someone behind me, but I didn't have time to be worrying about that. Acid burned my mouth as I vomited the tasteless food out into the toilet bowl. None of it had the slightest flavor going down, but coming back up, it was powerfully unpleasant. It seemed a bit unfair somehow.
何を勝手なこと。
Wasn't my sex the entire reason he'd cast Mom aside? What on earth was my father thinking? How could he say that? Why? He never even looked at me before. This had to be some kind of whim. He decided to play house for a while to appease his guilty conscience. Either that, or he needed to do so for some work-related reason.
ここもひどい。
How long would it take before I could find a safe haven? This was no better than living with my grandparents. No, in the countryside, at least I wasn't expected to do anything. There were expectations of me here. That made it even more agonizing.
何もしたくないのに。
Tasting the acid rising once more from the depths of my throat, I descended into self-pity. I would truly have preferred to shut myself up in a dark shed, to reject the world and do nothing at all for the rest of my life. But so long as I needed food to eat and a bed to sleep in, I had no choices but to play along with my father's momentary kindness. The thought triggered a new wave of nausea. One week passed. People often say that time flies when you're having fun. Perhaps it's true, because those first 7 days seemed to last a century. Hanging my bag next to my desk, I pulled out my notes and textbooks. I was as isolated and out of place as ever in my new school. I'd been studying a good deal, but that was simply my way of killing the vast stretches of otherwise painfully empty time I spent here. It certainly had absolutely nothing to do with my father's praise. I hadn't sketched for a few days now. For one thing, the weather had been dull and gray, so I couldn't look up without remembering that day, and I just hadn't been in the mood in the first place. Even if I opened my sketchbook today, I'd only end up with another drawing of the sky, as if I didn't have enough of those already. Those vaguely self-mocking thoughts stopped me on the way up to the roof, redirecting my path down to the lower floor. My life was a steady line from one meaningless moment to the next. Huh, there's actually nothing here? There must have been something there. But there was nothing for some reason. Just like what happened with Michiru's, right? She probably said something there. Human beings are frighteningly adaptable creatures. The meals with my father that had at first repulsed me to the point of vomiting were gradually growing tolerable. Sometimes I hated myself for that. But little by little, I was coming to understand that it wasn't just the result of my mind acclimatizing itself to the situation.
ユミコ、学校には慣れたか？
はい。
いきなりの転校で戸惑ったかもしれんが、すぐに友達もできる。お父さんの時もだな。
Apparently, Dad had gone through many transfers in his student years, and always struggled with how to present himself to his new classmates. But is that true, or is that just a lie? I was beginning to learn a number of surprisingly personal things about my father as he persistently tried to draw me into conversation.
ああ、そうか。今は時代も違うだろうからな。すまなかったな、ユミコ。
いいえ。
And he wasn't pushy or arrogant about it. He always seemed to be considering my point of view. Just as I'd heard, Dad was on an extremely tight schedule. Even when he returned home, it was extremely rare for him to stay overnight. Or more frequently, he would return to his company immediately after dinner. But that also meant he was coming home solely to share a meal with me. But why? I gradually grew less prickly and slightly more communicative. By now, I could eat dinner with him without a hint of queasiness.
どうしたユミコ？
いえ、なんでも。
Just as something was about to spill out of my mouth, Mom's pale, empty face had flashed before my eyes. Again, nothing there. She must be, like, talking something to herself, right? Lying in bed in my darkened room, I thought things over. I was no less uncertain than when I first arrived at that place, but the reasons for that inner turmoil were beginning to change. My father's attitude toward me was becoming harder to process. At first, I'd simply been disgusted by his overfamiliarity. But by that point, it was harder to dismiss as some bizarre game. Sometimes I could almost take his friendliness at face value. Even that remark about my hair might have been intended as nothing more than a casual compliment. Such positive interpretations were beginning to seem plausible.
そんなの、今更よ。
I tried mumbling negative words to myself, but the nagging doubts remained. My distant mother had grown kind when her condition improved. The situation was clearly different, but there was always the possibility my father had undergone a similar change in the years since I'd seen him last. Tossing and turning in my bed, I turned the questions over in my mind. I'd been so cold for so long, but little by little, I could feel something like warmth returning to my body. I'll just end up being betrayed again. This time will be different. With two opposing answers battling indecisively in my mind, I waited for dawn to come. That's a big jump in... yeah, in days. 3 months after my return to Tokyo, my life was beginning to change even outside of the house. School didn't seem particularly unpleasant anymore. It wasn't so difficult being alone in that place once you got used to it. So long as I quietly attended my classes, the entire day would pass easily enough. I never disliked studying, so once my mood took a turn for the better, it didn't feel like wasted time. The change in the seasons had brought more periods of clear weather. I'd resumed my habit of drawing on a daily basis. As my mind grew calm, my art slowly began to change as well. My perspective, pointed straight up for so long, began to creep downward. Every once in a while, I'd include a townscape or two among my sketches. It wasn't exactly principled of me to be finding enjoyment in that life, but there was no point sulking forever. My sardonic feelings of self-reproach slowly faded. I began to look at the world around me more calmly.
お帰りなさいませ。
ただいま。
Even those brutally awkward interactions with the household employees had gotten more tolerable with the passage of time. After a few weeks, they picked up on my non-reactions and began to tone down their aggressive approach. They would generally back off after letting me know they were available if I needed them. That arrangement was much more comfortable for me. By then, I actually was asking them for something every once in a while.
今日は部屋へすぐ戻られますか？
ええ、そのようにします。
かしこまりました。
After asking the maid to have someone call me when it was time for dinner, I returned to my room. Sitting down in front of my desk, I thought back over the last few months. My attitudes toward that new life were beginning to soften in many ways. The one exception, I was stubbornly continuing to keep my father at arm's length. His behavior hadn't changed. He'd continued to treat me kindly all the while. Nonetheless, I offered him nothing but brief monosyllabic answers, vaguely avoiding his questions. That had seemed only natural at first. What else could he expect after how he treated my mother? After abandoning me for years, that resentment seemed to justify my behavior. But months had passed, and I just couldn't see any sign of the cruel man I thought he was. At least not when he was interacting with me. Nearly every night, I rejected his gentle attempts to draw me into conversation. My father didn't seem to be letting that bother him, but I was beginning to feel increasingly guilty about my attitude.
どうしたらいいのかしら。
I threw the question up at my ceiling, knowing all too well that no answer would be forthcoming. It would be time for dinner soon. For a very different reason than before, I'd started to find that time somewhat painful.
今日も由美子の話題が出てな。榊さんのお嬢さんは可愛くて聡明でいらっしゃると目黒医大の先生もおっしゃってたよ。
I guess he's gonna, marry her off or something, yeah.
はい。
由美子がこんなにいい子に育って父さんも嬉しいよ、本当に。
This man had interacted with me as something close to an ideal father for 3 straight months. That day, as always, all that came out of his mouth were words of praise and concern for me. Uneasy feelings smoldered away quietly inside my chest.
なあ、由美子。
My father spoke to me in a kind tone of voice. I couldn't endure his gaze. I found myself hanging my head.
由美子。
I didn't dislike being praised. Not at all. He was making time in an extremely busy life for me. I wasn't yet cynical enough to dismiss that. Sometimes, I felt myself on the verge of being grateful.
ごめんなさい。
But no, not yet. That black grime was still inside me. There was always that utter emotion struggling against my guilt. So long as that remained, I would never allow myself to get any closer to my father.
ああ、母さんのことか。
I felt myself twitch with surprise. Until that point, I had deliberately steered clear of that particular topic. I'd assumed my father was intentionally avoiding it as well, so the turn of the conversation came as a real shock.
話して良いものかずっと迷っていたが、 ちゃんと話さないと由美子も納得してはくれないということなんだろうな。
そんな私は。
いいんだ。これは父さんが悪かったんだ。
My father slowly began to speak. He spoke about his feelings toward my mother, how it felt when she left, and behind everything, the constant stress his incredibly demanding job had placed on their marriage. Everything my father told me turned my image of him completely on its head.
二人が出て行った時、本当に辛かったよ。連れ戻しに行こうって何度も思った。
Damn it, Yumiko, this is why you're still a kid. This guy is an expert at controlling people. You think he can't control what you're feeling right now? You're being manipulated, damn you.
でも仕事に追われてそれができなかった。
In time, my increasingly isolated father began to seek comfort. He admitted that the affair described in the magazine article had happened at that time.
父さんも寂しかったんだ。会社でもいろいろとあって、いけないことと知りつつも、母さんを裏切るようなことをしてしまった。雑誌に記事が出たと聞いたとき、一番に考えたのは、母さんを巻き込んではいけないということだったんだ。それで弁護士を向かわせたんだが。
He was consistent. The actions that had seemed so inhumanly cruel at the time could also be explained by my father's story. I mean, of course. His job is to rationalize everything. After all, that lawyer never got the chance to speak with my mother. There was no proof he'd been sent to serve her with divorce papers. But even so...
由美子。
My father looked straight at my face across the table. I couldn't help myself. I returned his gaze. At some point, I'd forgotten even to avert my eyes.
お父さんを許してくれないか。
Nope. It was a gentle voice. I'd begun to think I would never hear a voice like that ever again, from anyone. And yet, it was coming to me from him, the person whose acceptance, in a way, I'd always wanted most.
私
Oh, sorry. Many thoughts flooded into my head in a confused jumble. Those words were more than powerful enough. My fragile defensive wall had finally sprung a leak.
ごめんなさい。
由美子。
ごめんなさい、お父さん。ちょっと私。
I slid from my chair, turned away from that concerned face, and hurried out to the hallway. Halfway covering my face with my right hand, I stumbled up the stairs as best as I could. On the way up, I caught a glimpse of a servant staring at me in shock, but I wasn't composed enough to pay that any mind. The world was growing hazy before I even reached my floor. And the instant I closed the door to my room behind me, the tears came pouring down my face. One drop stained the ivory carpet beneath my feet, then another.
お父さん、あんなこと。
It was hard to understand. I couldn't reconcile the man with the vicious, vulgar person the magazines described. There were so many things about him that confused me. But I couldn't believe he'd spoken those words for show. It sounded as if they'd come from the heart. This is why you're still a kid, damn you! Just as Mom had come to regret the cruel things she said to me, perhaps Dad was simply trying to make up for his mistakes. Looking at it from that angle, it wouldn't be so hard to accept his apology.
いいのかな。ね、お母さん。
I had one photograph of my mother left, safe in the memory of my mobile phone. But as always, her face was turned to the side. I couldn't read her expression.
今度こそ幸せになっても。
My life had been shades of gray for so very long. Little by little, I could see colors beginning to emerge. It was a pleasant feeling. Will you be happy though by like accepting his forgiveness? A fine spring day just before the rainy season. The sky above was remarkably beautiful. Putting down my brush, I stretched out and muttered a few words to no one in particular.
今日はこのぐらいにしておこうかしら。
Recently, I've been getting so absorbed in my art that it was easy to forget the time. There have been a few incidents where I kept my car waiting long enough to cause some anxiety, so I started making a conscious effort to check my watch frequently. I examined my sketchbook. Instead of the sky that I'd been devoted to for so long, today I had painted the rooftop flower bed.
こんなのが描けるようになったのね。
After months of obsessively sketching the clouds, the change had taken me by surprise. For a while, I just gazed down at that image, various emotions running through me.
いけない、時間。
I hurriedly gathered up my painting materials and pushed them into my bag. As it turned out, I was a little slow coming home after all. My life changed rapidly after my father's apology. The dinners together that had once been so painful were now something I look forward to. I talked to him about many things. My art, formerly sketches of the sky in black pencil, had become increasingly colorful work executed with paintbrushes. Even my life at school was shifting ever so slightly for the better.
榊さん、今ちょっといいかしら。飯田さん、いいわよ。
A girl who stood out even among the young ladies in her class, Ida Kanako, had begun to approach me on a regular basis.
ここがちょっとわからないんだけど、教えていただけるかしら。古文の現代語訳ね。確かにここは難しいわ。ちょっと待ってて。
We'd struck up a conversation about our work in art class one day, and I'd been talking like this pretty frequently ever since. She wasn't quite a friend yet, but up until then, I'd almost never had actual conversations in school with anyone but the teachers. By my standards, it was an enormous step forward.
ありがとう。榊さんの説明には無駄がなくていいわ。そんな、私はただ普通に話しているだけよ。そんなことないわよ。先生とか向いてるかもね。
Damn it, again with the nothing displaying. I hope nothing important is actually shown there.
ああ、ただいま、由美子。
Dad was still an incredibly busy man. Nonetheless, he would always come home at least a few times every week to have dinner with me. I used to only see his face during the meal itself, but recently I'd started greeting him at the door with a natural smile on my face.
今日はね、飯田さんとずっとお話ししていて。
おお、前に言っていた友達のことだね。
まだ友達とかじゃないんだけど。
Previously, my father had talked and talked while I offered only brief responses, but the situation was largely reversed. I told Dad about everything, every trivial little thing in my life. No matter what the topic, he never failed to hear me out with a smile. That made me happy.
なあ、由美子。
どうしたの、お父さん。
美佐子が治ったら、3人で海外旅行にでも行くか。忙しくてそういうことをしてあげられなかったからな。それとも何か別のことがいいか？
私、遊園地がいいな。
遊園地？そんなのいつだって行けるだろ
う。うん、そこがいいの。
My father looked mystified. Still, I stuck to my guns. When I was very small and very lonely, the idea of a family visit to an amusement park had enchanted me. I was well past the age to be begging for a trip like that, but that secret yearning had never really gone away.
そうか。わかった。父さんの会社の系列にも遊園地はあるからな。それこそ貸し切りで行こうか。
うん、そんなのじゃなくていい。普通にでいいから。
由美子はいつも控えめだな。よし。じゃあ美佐子が 母さんが治ったら3人で遊園地に行くか。
Dad spoke those words with a smile. It was the first time I'd asked him for anything. Even as my days become happier, I'd been careful not to say anything greedy, anything about the things I wanted. I suppose I couldn't quite believe that tranquil life was real. If I asked too much of the dream, I was afraid it might just fall apart underneath me.
今日は父さんとそんな話をした。
In that half year, the size of my diary entries had increased exponentially. Where I used to write nothing happened again and again, ripping off the bottom of the page for scrap paper, now I was often running out of space before I could cover everything. And in the center of my room, a canvas stood on an easel, surrounded by a colorful array of art supplies, all things I'd purchased and used frequently.
もう本当に大丈夫よね。
Will something happen again? Will it fall apart in the blink of an eye? Everything was so peaceful that at times it made me uneasy. Come to think of it, those few days before my mother was scheduled to leave the hospital had felt very much the same.
最後出しておこうかな。
I'm quite sure I scribbled those words at the end of my diary entry. It was the one small wish I would allow myself. What is it? I want to know, damn it! The rainy season had come and gone. Summer vacation was fast approaching. It was a day like any other. Reading on the internet that the weather would be taking a turn for the worse in the afternoon, I called off my usual rooftop painting session and went home a little early.
ここで止めてもらっていいですか？
いいんですか。まだ少し歩きますが。
今日はちょっと歩きたい気分なので。
They said it would be raining in the evening, but for the moment, it was a clear and pleasant summer afternoon. Therefore, I got out of the car halfway and walked the remaining kilometer or so home. There wasn't any real reason for that. It was just a whim. When I opened the front door and slipped inside, I found the entrance hall empty of the servants who were usually there to greet me.
誰もいない。
It was probably because I'd returned so suddenly. Even when I closed the door behind me, the hallway remained silent.
台所の方にでもいるのかしら。
Not that it really bothered me either way. I began to move toward the stairs.
ですので、そちらについても由美子様に気づかれないようにしています。
But a voice from deeper in the hallway stopped me in my tracks. If that woman hadn't happened to speak my name at that very moment, without a doubt, I would have shrugged, gone up the stairs to my room, and stayed completely oblivious.
私のこと？
I slowly inched my way down the passage, careful not to make a sound, and stopped just before a corner. From the other side, I could hear the 3 employees who usually met me at the door talking about something.
今のところ問題なく進んでいるようだな。
はい。由美子様もすっかり旦那様に懐いているようです。
そうか、ならばいい。旦那様からは引き続き動向に注意しろと言われている。何かあったらすぐに報告するようにな。
わかりました。
They were speaking quietly, but I could make out their conversation clearly enough.
何のことを言っているの？
I shouldn't be listening to this. My throbbing heart was making that very clear. But my feet wouldn't budge, and my ears were intent on capturing every word of their discussion.
しかし、こういう逆転劇もあるのね。びっくりしちゃった。
後継ぎの息子が急逝したから子供の中で一番成績のいい操りやすそうなあの子を引っ張ってくるとかわかりやすいわよね旦那様も。
Oh, okay, that was... I guess the son died. I thought that he was gonna give everything to this girl so that, you know, the son can take it after he was a bit bigger, but I guess I forgot what happened. Okay.
あの愛人、息子の亡くなった当日に出てったみたいよ。
そりゃ居場所なくしちゃうわよね。
My body had begun to tremble. It was a part of the story I'd almost pushed out of my mind by now. That mistress, and the boy she'd supposedly given birth to. I'd always thought it strange. Why had Dad called me for when he did? Why suddenly approach a daughter you tossed aside once before?
旦那様もやることが徹底してるわよね。更新所使ってまであの子の情報を仕入れてさ、さも自分がちゃんと見ていたかのような取り繕い方して。
I thought that attention was his way of atoning for my mother's suffering.
今まで全然興味すらなかったのにね。そういうふりしなきゃあの子に取り入れないから必死なのよ。
一種の洗脳プログラムよね、あれ。最初はぎこちなく接するふりして、その後確信をついて打ち解ける。精神科のお医者さんまで呼んで策を練ったそうね。
I thought that was his attempt at finally becoming a father to me. See the typo? Double at?
それにあっさりと騙されるお嬢様か。
No, I simply convinced myself it had to be that way. Deep down, I knew all along that it couldn't possibly have been true.
おい、やめないか。そろそろそのお嬢様の戻られる時間だ。
はいはい。
ちょっと前までどうでもいい存在だったのに、道具として利用価値が出た瞬間にこれだもの。すごい世界よね。
で、またどっかで男の子が生まれた瞬間、一気にお払い箱になると。
I guess that's true.
そうか、その手がまだあったか。
見てみたいわよね、その表変する瞬間。
おい、いい加減にしないか。
はいはい。
With that languid response, the group dispersed. Even long after the footsteps faded away, I stood there in silence, perfectly still. An idle question occurred to me. What sort of an expression do I have on my face right now? What sort of expression do people make at times like these? I felt oddly detached from reality, as though watching a movie projected before my eyes by some hidden camera. Eventually, I took one step, then another. I dragged myself up the stairs on legs that didn't feel like my own. They said it would be raining in the evening, but it was a clear and pleasant summer afternoon. Therefore, I got out of the car halfway and walked the remaining kilometers or so home. There wasn't any real reason for that. There wasn't any reason at all. And so, I could only curse God. I reached my room. It was far too quiet inside. I'd almost begun to forget how painful the absence of sound could be. I'd almost begun to find the silence comfortable.
よし。じゃあ美佐子が母さんが治ったら3人で遊園地に行くか。
なんでそんなことを平然と言えるの。
Scraps of notebook paper danced around me. Fragments of the word dad, fragments of the word happy, fragments of sentences highlighted in bright colors. A half-year preserved in joyful words scattered through the air. The upper half of my painting was thick with dabs of blue and yellow paint. That was the first part to go. With a harsh rip, the cloth tore away from one of the screws holding it in place, and as the canvas curled in on itself, white paint fell to the ground like a dusting of snow. In the lightless room, white, blue, and yellow flew about. Shattered and torn, powerless and broken, they melted one by one into the darkness. Unable to think, unable to act, I endured the night. The time came for me to wake up. Acting on pure reflexive habit, I stood up on unsteady feet and made my preparations. Pathetically enough, there was still a part of me holding on to hope. The house was no longer a refuge, but I'd begun to make a small place for myself at school. I could just make more friends, find people to talk to. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe that would be something.
飯田さん。
I caught a glimpse of the face I was looking for from the hallway. Ida-san might be willing. If I kept talking to her, little by little, she might become my friend.
ですって。それで、
Ida-san seemed to be talking to somebody. I peered in through the window. She was sitting at the very center of a group of girls. I just have to talk to her later, when she was alone.
榊さんって妾の子なんだって。お父様が。
The child of a mistress. Filthy words. The sort of words that almost never left that girl's mouth. The same hateful words they'd printed in the magazine that changed everything.
まだちょっとあの子に優しくしておこうかと思うの。
え、どうしてそんなことするの？そんな子だったらなおさら無視しておけば。
だってそうしたらもっと興味深い話が聞けるかもしれないじゃない。どうやって榊の家に母親が取り入ったのかとか。それでね。
For some reason, I thought of fruit hanging from a tree. At first, it ripens and swells on the end of its branch, beautiful and tempting. But in time, its coloration grows impure and unattractive. Its point of connection to the tree begins to creak from the strain. One thread of fiber snaps, then another. The thin line holding it to life and nourishment grows thinner and thinner. I entered the classroom. The girls who had been snickering about me until a moment before innocently looked away and moved on to another topic of conversation. A few moments after dropping my bag by my desk, I slowly began to walk in their direction. I felt every movement of my feet with a brilliant, eerie clarity. This might be what it's like to take the last few steps toward the summit of a high mountain. A climber has the thrill of achieving something, but in the determination, the clear-minded acceptance of fate, there might be something similar. Or so I thought, a spectator to my own actions.
あら、榊さん、何のご用かしら？
Ida Kaneko turned to face me with her usual placid smile. I had already decided what would happen next. Familiar feelings swelled inside me, the same as when I'd cut my hair, my diary, my canvas.
どうしたの、榊さん。お顔の色がよろしくないわ。先生に。
Ida Kaneko's hand reached out to me. To my eyes, it looked like the grasping claw of a corpse pulling me down into hell. I'd understood all along. I'd simply kept myself from noticing. There was never any place of refuge here. I'd forced myself to believe in lies because I couldn't keep going without them. But I'd finally found another way to live. I watched serenely as the blood spurted out. For a moment, she couldn't even process what had happened. For just a moment, she stared down blankly at her hand, at her palm, dyed in red. Ida Kaneko collapsed in slow motion. Desks clattered all around. The others backed away as if distancing themselves from a live bomb.
榊さん、あなた、一体何してるの？
先生、誰か呼んできて、先生を。
That's right. I should have cut it all apart. I should have just shut off my brain and cut my way to freedom. I was grinding my teeth as hard as I could. There were tears streaming down my face. But all things considered, I didn't feel particularly sad. Much the opposite. Since the blade had finally severed me from the lies, I was filled with a strange sense of relief. It felt as though a white, shining road forward had been revealed to me.
そうよね。こうなるのよね。
I shouldn't have hoped for a happy ending in the first place. Everything was scripted from the very start. And the actress had passively accepted her role, dreaming of a heartwarming conclusion to the black comedy that had been written for her. At some point, I'd begun to laugh. The tears were still rolling down my cheeks, but there was no sadness in me anymore. I'd left most of that behind on the day my mother broke, and the rest on the day my father betrayed me. I'd depleted my stock of sorrow. Just how much of a clown do I need to be? Just how pathetic do I need to become? What do I need to do to satisfy my cowering audience? To please the god who wrote this play? Their eyes watched me from what felt like an enormous distance, pushing me lower and lower into the dirt.
おかしいわよね。
I brandished the open box cutter in my right hand toward the back of the classroom. Incoherent little shrieks from my classmates were the only response. A few girls had already broken down in tears.
笑いなさいよあなたたちいつも見てたんでしょ滑稽だってほら笑えばいいじゃないのねえ
I laughed in their place, even when the teachers who came running pinned me down, even when they carried me out of the classroom like some sort of terrorist. Would it be odder not to laugh at something so utterly ridiculous? When they took me away, I noticed my desk standing isolated in the chaos, and felt a twinge of pity at leaving it behind. Until the very end, I could never see the person who supposedly sat there. My father acted swiftly once he was notified. A settlement was reached with the Ida family. The incident was erased without so much as a disciplinary hearing. At first, my father tried to coax me out of my locked room with gentle words, but I refused to acknowledge his existence. After 2 months of that siege, I was half forced out, loaded unceremoniously into a car, and brought to a town where the air smelled of salt water. I understood what sort of a place it was the moment I saw the high wall surrounding it. It was a housing facility, a pleasant little cage where I could be safely stowed away without the risk of causing further trouble. A woman who introduced herself as the principal introduced me to the school, with a slightly fearful expression on her face. She brought me to an empty dormitory and told me it would be my new home. When I checked the bank book I'd been handed on the way over, I found a rather excessive amount of pocket money in my account. From the day I began to wear an exceptionally flashy school uniform and commute to Mihama Academy, I haven't been face to face with my father even once. And now we're back to the present. Damn, that actually took longer than I thought. I actually went like an hour plus ahead of where I thought I would stop. I didn't really give a lot of my thoughts though on the matter because I wanted to process what was going on first until the conclusion of her flashback. But I feel like in Yumiko's if I were to be in Yumiko's shoes, I would have snapped a lot faster. And I would have done so in a lot more brutal way. When the mom said, "Why couldn't you be a boy?" I probably would have snapped and probably done something that I would have regret. I mean, come on. She was like what? She was in middle school and her mom had the gall to actually say that. If I were in her shoes, I probably would have choked her or something. Maybe she wouldn't die, I don't know, right? But if I were in her shoes, that's probably what I would do. I don't know. I guess I'm a lot more violent of a person than I thought. And with the dad, in case with the dad, I guess I kind of understand her feelings about wanting to believe in a tale that's unrealistic, believing in a lie as long as it meant that you can become happy. Because throughout her life, I guess she hasn't been happy, right? But again, there is one fundamental problem with her. Even though, yes, as a kid, you were given the life you were given, right? And you couldn't try to achieve your own happiness. But as you grow older, I think you at that point you can find something that will make you happy that's not connected to your family, that's not connected to your, circumstances. I feel like Yumiko was running away too much, too often, and was too scared to even find that sort of like transient happiness for herself. And in that last part where she cut her friend, damn, I guess this is because this is anime and they can't really make Yumiko into a waifu that kills people. But if this was like a story based like in the US or something, I think Yumiko would have been killing a lot of people there, you know? Just saying. Even myself, if I were in her shoes, I'd probably stab the person there. And I'd probably use my age as an excuse. Because remember, when you kill someone at that age, it's still considered a delinquent or a juvenile act, and not really like planned killing and stuff like that. Because God, those people are so trash. All right, enough of enough of the dark topics, I guess. I hope you guys enjoyed the double episode here. Or not double episode, but this is going to be an episode that's going to be cut into 2 episodes. But yeah, I feel like the reason why I think that this route was not as good as the other routes was that because when I was younger, my personality or what I would do would be projected into what the person that's going through the story would be doing, right? What I'm trying to say is that Yumiko does something that I feel like I personally wouldn't do. And when I was younger, I feel like, damn, the only reason why you got this way is because you made these choices yourself. So that's why I wasn't really sympathetic of Yumiko, I guess. But now I can kind of understand that. And also, I'm like I said, I'm a lot more violent as a person. I kind of realize that the more I play these story games where you're being put in a situation where you're like in a situation basically where you're powerless. I feel like I'm the type of person that would rebel more the more the powerless I feel, the more powerless I feel. But all right, like I said, enough of me just blabbering on and on about stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Give it a like if you like it. Sub if you haven't. Patreon will be getting these episodes a lot faster as per usual. And I will be seeing you guys next time. Peace out. Damn, I really need to get some food.